standalone, one-off locations. The next one I want to talk about is the New Mexico desert when the atomic bomb goes off. So the way this is handled is we get a huge wide shot of the desert in stark black and white. There's a countdown, and then we see the mushroom cloud beginning, and it starts very small in the frame, like we're very far away from it, which is a really interesting aesthetic choice. It's really startling and kind of overwhelming, but it's tiny in the frame. But then we zoom into it and we go inside of the flames and inside of the particles, and that's where we start to see all of these strange little bits of, the Twin Peaks mythology forming and breaking off, along with a lot of abstraction that is very reminiscent of like 2001: A Space Odyssey at the end when he goes through the wormhole, for example. So one thing I did think was interesting is that Lynch creates the sense of this physical force just overwhelming the viewer through the camera movement more than just the act itself. I'm talking about that initial camera movement into the cloud because, like I said, it's tiny. It's almost like itself an atom in the frame. It's so small. And it only gets bigger as we approach it. So I thought that was an interesting decision.
So this is supposed to be the origin story of Twin Peaks, right? That was the conceit behind this?
That's what Mark Frost says, yes. And we're going to talk a little bit, I think, about... But yes, Frost has said that his idea for Part 8 was to show an origin story for, like, the Twin Peaks mythology.
This concept of the atom bomb going off and all of the visuals associated with it, which were just... They were startling, they were amazing, but they were also, like I don't want to keep coming back to this word, but oppressive. We have a fairly decent-sized TV. It's not huge, but if you had like a big TV with some really hefty surround sound equipment, this would just almost be anxiety-inducing, this whole scene, having all of that going on the screen and all around you, because you have this sense of constant movement with all of the visuals, and it's almost like you're on this roller coaster ride that you don't know when it's going to stop.
I mentioned the camera movement in slowly to the cloud, but that's another key aspect, is it's slow.
So do you feel like that choice was made as a way to force us to ponder about it?
And to anticipate, I think. Or
Yeah,
to know we're not there yet, but we're going there. And I think Lynch works so well with dread generally, and that's a great way of evoking it. He took something that has been photographed quite a lot, and he presented it in a really fascinating way that off the top of my head, I can't think of another example of showing like a mushroom cloud that's dealt with it in that manner.
It seems like the atom bomb, the most of the time that you get that whenever you're watching something else, you see it go off and it takes up the whole frame almost immediately. And then you're just whited out as your screen gets whited out, and then you click to the aftermath of that.
As far as like my feelings about seeing the atom bomb, I just kind of felt like I was slowly being brought in, but also being forced to view it in a way, even though that was an impressive shot. But what came after with like the internality of the combustible material, because it looked alive. Like the explosive cloud tunnel had a pulse, though it was irregular, like something was coming to life. Some of it was even reminiscent of commingling of fluids and contracting tissues, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I have more to say about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. It's so fascinating because it's destruction and birth in the same, like not even at the same time, but as the same phenomenon. I think you may have mentioned this on your previous episode, but the famous quote from J. Robert Oppenheimer when he saw the bomb was, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds," which is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is like a text that Lynch has often quoted on Twitter. I think back in 2009, he went on a spiel of like for weeks just quoting passages of the Bhagavad Gita. And it's interesting that in Hinduism, you often have this idea of creation and destruction as part of the same process. And so it's fascinating that for this episode and what is considered an origin story and basically a creation myth for the mythology, it's also an image of pure absolute destruction.
Right. And that was something that I sort of focused on in regards to this episode, because there's two sides of a coin here, where you have every creative act has its destructive consequence, but then you also have every destructive act has its creative consequence.
Another duality about this decision to make the Trinity test the origin story, or at least our starting point chronologically for this Twin Peaks mythology, is that you have the atom bomb as kind of a symbol of creation. Like, this could be the Big Bang. This could almost be anything, but it's also a very specific historical event that was created by people. So you have a creation story that's both kind of abstract and eternal and extremely historically specific and man-made.
Right.
And I love the fact that it works both ways, because I think that's generally true of the Twin Peaks mythology. I mean, I've talked about this a lot with you guys, both in person and with the feedback, that with Firewalk with Me, you have a sense that the human characters are almost calling upon the spiritual being. So like Mike shows up when Leland has just been reminded of Teresa. And, the Tremonts show up when Laura's lost her diary and she needs kind of a new escape route or something. And so that's the small-scale domestic example of that, the very personalized psychological story. And here you have it almost as a historical phenomenon where it's the acts of men to, create this weapon that calls the spirits forth.
I know. I've always been enamored by that general theme of creating your own monsters, creating your own demons, so to speak. So we create the things that eventually haunt us and or destroy us. So the atom bomb being a somewhat of a bit of a on the nose way to do that, but given the visuals, that's easily forgivable.
And that's what I meant.
I agree.
At the opening about this being a human wrought horror, like which becomes sort of cosmic. But it's specifically, I think, an American horror story writ large, with our worst crime figuring in as the antagonist.
Also, and this is partly because I have trouble with a lot of the focus that people have on this idea of evil and Judy as the evil, which I think sometimes for me falls a little flat. I think one of the significant things about this event is obviously, people have said like this was the birth of evil in the world or something, which is like, wait a second, this came literally at the end of 6 years of like genocide and war. Like, what are you talking about? But like, I think the significance is the physical aspect as well. The fact that it's actually almost violating a law of nature, or at least manipulating it in a way never before seen, where you're actually splitting an atom and creating this breach. Put it this way, he's not showing the atomic bomb landing on Hiroshima. He's showing it being tested for the first time. We have the implication in our mind, and certainly the music choice is specifically dedicated to the victims of Hiroshima. So that aspect is there as well, but I think it's interesting that he highlights a moment where the destructive force was mostly, or at least in terms of human lives, it was mostly potential at that point. But just the act of doing it was enough to create this rift.
It's almost like we ate more fruit from the garden that we weren't supposed to eat, and now here's our punishment. But I definitely agree.
Totally.
I definitely agree with what you're saying. Like I think it's kind of naive to say that this is the beginning of all evil. Evil as a concept. I mean, even if you divorce it from biblical stuff or whatever, you can see it going back through all cultures, all the way back to the beginning of time. So it's nothing new. So this has to be the genesis of evil, if we're going to see it that way at all, of what's going on with the whole Lodge lore and Bob and et cetera, et cetera. So it's that specific strain of it coming, which we can maybe assume from a different dimension or something.
Mm-hmm. So moving chronologically, I guess, within the story, but not through the actual events of the episode, I next want to talk about the White Sand sequence, where the woodsman and the frog bug invade the town. And we'll save some of the analysis of that till the Lodge lore section, but just to kind of lay out what happens there. A girl and a boy are returning from a date in this small desert town. He asks her for a kiss, and they kiss, and she kind of blushes and walks away, and we see her in her room kind of swooning a little bit, and then her radio starts to get fuzzy. And meanwhile, we've seen these woodsmen come down from the sky and terrorize this couple on the road, on the highway, asking, got a light, with the cigarette in his hand. And then one of them enters a radio station, kills the receptionist, and seizes the DJ's head and starts reciting this strange poem, which we'll definitely save for the Lodge lore section. And not only the girl, but other people listening to the radio, a mechanic and a woman in a diner, pass out on the floor. And this allows the frog bug that is hatched out of an egg in the desert to crawl into the girl's mouth. And the woodsman, after he's read the poem many times, he crushes the man's skull, walks back outside, and we hear a horse neigh or whinny in the night. And then, interestingly, Lynch cuts back to the girl lying in bed, and we end. The credits roll over her face, and there's a little bit of an electric buzz there. So there's a lot going on here. I recently described this as basically, like I said, George Lucas must have loved this episode because it's basically American Graffiti on acid. It's that 50s all-American imagery with a monster movie thrown in. But interestingly, it's also much like quieter than a lot of than like a Happy Days or a Rebel Without a Cause or what would American Graffiti. It's like
it's less inhabited.
There's so much.
There's
there's so much space between them.
You don't even see Sarah's parents, which is sort of strange, I think, because she seems vulnerable.
Yeah, with the window open and everything.
Let's talk about the fact that, of course, according to the final dossier, the book by Mark Frost, and comments he's made elsewhere, this little girl is Sarah Palmer, even though it's never mentioned in the show.
Right. So we have to take that as fact, right?
Yeah.
That is a great question.
Wait.
I do. But
until
there's
the next
some interesting
book comes
qualifications.
Out, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's the qualifications you have?
I think there's a lot of stuff Frost says that Lynch is not necessarily on the same page with. I kind of don't think this is one of them, though, because the way Frost describes, he gave a talk right before the book came out where he said, we wanted people to kind of figure out for themselves who this was, but we hope maybe they'd figure it out by the end. And there's also so many details in the episode that it does feel like Lynch and Frost were both in on this. Like, it wasn't something Frost came up with afterwards to explain what they'd come up with. It feels like something they had an idea of going in. But the qualifications are, first of all, I don't think both of the actresses, both the actor and the actress, and, it's only applicable to the boy if we think he's Leland, which I wouldn't really think anyways. Doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
But they're two of the few, non-white characters in Twin Peaks, or non-white actors, I should say. I know the boy is Hispanic, and I believe the girl, I'm not sure. I think she has sort of an indigenous background based on her name and some other stuff. That's an interesting casting decision, especially for someone like Lynch, who has been criticized for not casting many actors in Twin Peaks who aren't white. Why would he choose, for the part that actually is supposed to grow up and be a specific actress?
Right, because
so that's one thing that's a little odd.
I do remember doing a little bit of research at the time when we did cover this back in 2017, that I looked into the town that was affected by the atom bomb. Mm-hmm. And it was primarily a Latino population there. And in fact, there were some pictures of some of the children, and the actor that played the I can't remember the boy's name. I think he's just boy, isn't he?
Yeah, just boy and girl in the credits.
He looks remarkably like a picture of one of the children that they featured in that article I was reading.
There's a lot of stuff in this story that makes it feel, and I felt this at the time, like way before Frost said it or anything like that. This kind of has to be Sarah. First of all, she seems to have some kind of psychic ability. She says to the boy, "You live in town." He goes, "How did you know that?" She goes, "Oh, I just knew." Or something more specific than that, like you live near the school or something like that. And she's the perfect age to be Grace Zabrisky's age. The big thing is, of course, the frog bug crawls into her mouth, and then later we see Sarah Palmer take off her face, and we see Judy. And
right.
We'll save that part for the Lodge lore, because that gets kind of down into the weeds. But I know when I watched this episode at the time, I loved this whole episode, and I loved that part, and I loved the fact that we were going into what seemed like this different world, and I had a few ideas about it. One thing, I felt like it really tapped into that deep kind of almost that like American mythos that Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive tap into really well, and Fire Walk with Me too in some ways. In like a very, Steve, you were saying it felt like watching a movie. Like this felt very much like a movie, just the way it unfolded, And I was kind of hoping, I think, in some way, even though I wanted to get back to some of the stuff that, the return had been developing, I was hoping like part 9 would open in that town and they, would see the girl the next day and she'd be encountering the boy and she'd be acting kind of strange. And it would almost continue that storyline, maybe just for one episode. And like not give us answers, but just give us more time in that world. And I was really looking forward to that. And I think I was a little disappointed when part 9 came out and it was like, okay, back to the normal Twin Peaks The Return. And of course, we never go back to this world. It's just meant to be a one-off. And it's very powerful like that. So I can't complain too much. But part of me would have loved for that to be a moment where the narrative pulls like a Lost Highway or Mulholland Drive and takes us into something that seems like another narrative altogether for a while.
We had a 2-week break after that, didn't we?
That's right. We did. Yeah.
There was 2 whole weeks where we didn't have an episode?
Yeah,
or was
I think so. So it was almost...
Yeah, that's a good point to do that at, though.
Yeah.
To just... I didn't have any expectations of what... I had long since, before this episode came out, ditched any expectations of what I thought Lynch and Frost were going to do with the next episode, because they really pulled out all the stops at excelling at defying everybody's expectations with this whole series, with the whole return. Some of it obviously dictated by where they wanted the story to go, but some of it I feel like they had an impish, gleam in their eyes when they did, like, okay, the audience wants this, but we're going to give them this, and that's how it's going to roll out. Deal with it type thing. So I didn't really think along those lines at all, but I like you, I did enjoy those scenes. And aside from Dune, the first David Lynch movie that I'd ever seen that M introduced me to was Blue Velvet, where so it makes sense. It would have made sense if he did open episode 9 like that, because he seems to like to dwell in these areas. And I mean, so much of the original series of Twin Peaks is built around that small town thing that you're talking about, that Americana mythology that we've built up halfway through Norman Rockwell and halfway through our own imaginations.
I think I expected that we would get back to it at some point, but there were by the time we got to the finale, there were so many things that were left hanging.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of some of the storylines, Audrey's storyline, obviously. Some of the minor characters, I didn't really feel affronted, I guess, by the fact that, because it just kind of fit the theme.
Yeah, it was par for the course, and kind of expected that we wouldn't get any more.
But I mean, it still made me wonder, how does this figure into the larger story? Because I think we're meant to think about that in that way.